The damp, humid air of the Transcaucasus clung to the flight line like a wet shroud. It was just after 0400 hours, and the pre-dawn darkness was the heaviest cloak of all. The only illumination came from the sickly yellow floodlights mounted high above the revetments, casting long, fractured shadows across the tarmac and the angular silhouettes of the parked aircraft. Inside the dimly lit mess hall, Senior Lieutenant Alexander Zuyev, 27 years old, a gifted pilot with a reputation for both brilliance and insubordination, moved with a controlled, surgical precision that belied his nervous energy. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, cheap rye bread, and the heavy, slightly metallic aroma of kasha, the gray, nutrient-dense breakfast porridge that fueled the Soviet Air Force. Zuyev stood by the serving station, his dark blue uniform perfectly pressed, his movements observed only by a drowsy cook wiping down a stainless steel counter. This was the moment. The culmination of months of planning, fueled by a corrosive disillusionment with the Soviet system and a deep, personal despair. Zuyev's goal was not merely to defect, it was to strike a blow against the massive, unyielding machinery of the Soviet military that he felt was crushing his soul. In his pocket, Zuyev carried a small, meticulously prepared plastic vial. It contained an industrial-strength sleeping agent, potent enough to ensure a profound and protracted unconsciousness. As the cook turned his back to retrieve a fresh kettle of boiling water, Zuyev performed the critical, terrifying act. He quickly uncorked the vial and, with practiced ease, poured a calculated amount of the colorless, odorless liquid into the main cauldron of kasha, enough to incapacitate the 20-odd members of his squadron and the maintenance crews scheduled for the early shift. He stirred it briefly, expertly, with the ladle, then stepped back, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The sound, he felt, must surely be audible to the cook, to the whole base. It was not. The kasha looked exactly as it always did, a bland, innocuous bowl of collective sustenance. The first pilots began to shuffle in, their faces grim and unwashed, their minds still trapped in the dregs of sleep. They lined up, took their portions, and sat down at the long wooden tables. Zuyev took a serving himself, carefully avoiding the doped mixture in the main cauldron, and sat down to watch the inevitable. The small talk was minimal, grunts about the poor weather, complaints about the endless exercises, the usual low-level discontent that permeated the Soviet military apparatus. If you're watching this video, pause right now and drop a comment below with the city and time where you are watching this, to let us know where this story reached you. Minutes bled into what felt like hours. The first signs were subtle, a slumping posture, a hand resting heavier on a forehead, a sudden, unnaturally heavy yawn. Then, more pronounced, one of the older maintenance sergeants simply slid from his bench onto the floor with a soft thud. A flight engineer, mid-sentence about a faulty rudder actuator, let his chin hit his chest and began to snore lightly. The drug was working with a brutal efficiency. Zuyev ate his own undoctored breakfast slowly, maintaining the facade of a tired, ordinary pilot. He watched the last two officers, mid-conversation about a recent posting, go completely silent, their heads settling onto the table among the crumbs of their bread. The mess hall was now eerily, profoundly quiet, save for the low, rhythmic rasp of drugged breathing. The maintenance and flight crews of his entire squadron, his pursuers, were neutralized. Zuyev rose from the table. The act felt monumental, like leaving one world and entering another. He stepped carefully over the legs of a slumped officer, moving towards the exit. The air outside was colder now, sharper. The moment of no return had passed. He was now a criminal, a traitor to the state, and a fugitive. His objective, Hangar 3, where his assigned aircraft, a state-of-the-art MiG-29 Fulcrum, the jewel of Soviet air superiority, waited, armed and fueled. The perimeter alarms and armed guards were the next obstacles, but Zuyev knew the shift change schedule and the blind spots of the base's security protocols better than the security officers themselves. He had, after all, helped write the internal procedures. Zuyev emerged from the mess hall and moved swiftly, pressing himself against the cold concrete wall of the building. The air base at Mikitskaya, near the Turkish border, was an expansive and complex labyrinth of hardened aircraft shelters, maintenance bays, and administrative buildings. To the casual eye, it was a perfectly secured military installation. To Zuyev, it was a poorly maintained stage for his desperate act. He relied on the predictability of the Soviet military machine, the ingrained apathy of guards on long, freezing night shifts, and the absolute certainty that no one expected one of their own to attempt a full-scale defection using a frontline fighter jet. His route to Hangar 3 was a calculated risk. He bypassed the main vehicle access road, opting instead for a narrow service track that ran parallel to the main taxiway. The sound of his leather boots on the gravel was a piercing noise in the pre-dawn silence, and he forced himself to adopt a measured, steady pace. Anything resembling a run would immediately draw suspicion from the few sentries who were awake and patrolling. He passed the main communications block, its windows dark and silent, then skirted the fuel depot, where the sickly sweet odor of jet fuel, kerosene-based T-1, hung heavy in the air. He reached the series of concrete-hardened aircraft shelters, HAS, massive, bomb-proof structures designed to protect the Soviet Air Force's most valuable assets. His heart hammered, but his hands remained steady as he approached the entrance to Hangar 3. A single, young conscript, Private Volkov, was posted at the entrance. Volkov was an easily bored 19-year-old from the Urals whom Zuyev knew preferred daydreaming about his girlfriend to inspecting identification. Zuyev walked up to the private. He didn't fumble for his ID. Instead, he maintained his rank and authority, the power of the star on his shoulder boards. "Private, I'm taking the Fulcrum out for an unscheduled pre-flight check. Technical order change from headquarters. Open the door, I need to complete the cold start procedure immediately." Volkov, half asleep and intimidated by the senior lieutenant's rank, barely glanced at Zuyev. "But comrade senior lieutenant, the maintenance schedule isn't until 0800. And the ground crew hasn't checked in." Zuyev leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, injecting just enough urgency and authority to shut down further questioning. "This is highly sensitive, Volkov. A technical directive from Moscow, a new radar jamming countermeasure. Top secret. It must be tested immediately before the American satellites are in position. If you delay this, you'll face a court-martial for jeopardizing state security. Do you understand, Private?" Volkov swallowed hard, his eyes wide. The words Moscow, top secret, and court-martial were the ultimate paralyzing combination for a Soviet conscript. He snapped to attention. "Yes, comrade senior lieutenant. Right away, comrade." He fumbled with the heavy brass keys and the electronic access panel. With a mechanical groan that seemed to echo across the silent base, the massive, reinforced hangar door began to retract upwards, revealing the dark cavern within. Inside Hangar 3, bathed in the cool, industrial light of the bay, sat the aircraft of Zuyev's obsession and his vehicle to freedom, Blue 18, the MiG-29, its twin-tail fins and lethal geometry defining the pinnacle of Soviet fighter technology. It was armed with R-27 medium-range and R-73 short-range air-to-air missiles, fully fueled for an operational sortie, and loaded with the necessary chaff and flare countermeasures. Zuyev had personally ensured its readiness during the previous day's checks. He nodded sharply to Volkov. "Stand guard here, Private. Don't let anyone near this area until I taxi out. I mean anyone. This is your personal responsibility to the motherland." Volkov stood stiffly, rifle clutched across his chest, now fully awake and deeply panicked about his sudden, secret duty. Zuyev stepped into the hangar, the sheer size and silence of the aircraft filling his vision. He clambered up the integrated ladder and slipped into the cockpit, a familiar, well-worn space that felt like a second skin. The scent of ozone, hydraulic fluid, and old sweat filled the tight compartment. He began the ignition sequence. The checklist was etched into his memory: main battery on, circuit breaker set, fuel pumps engaged, external power connected. He needed to avoid using the base's external power unit, which would alert the ground control tower. Instead, he relied on the internal APU, auxiliary power unit, a self-contained engine designed for engine starting in remote locations. He pressed the APU start button. Deep within the aircraft's spine, a high-pitched whine began, quickly escalating to a powerful, vibrating roar. The cockpit display screens flickered to life in a cascade of green and orange. The twin Klimov RD-33 turbofan engines were dormant giants, waiting for their electrical cue. This noise, the APU running, was the first audible indication to the outside world that something was happening in Hangar 3, and Zuyev knew he was already running dangerously low on time. His drugged squadron mates might be out for hours, but the noise alone could still trigger an alert from the tower or a passing security patrol. The margin for error was now zero. The roar of the auxiliary power unit, APU, was a deafening reassurance and a screaming warning all at once. Inside the cockpit, the canopy, a thick sheet of hardened acrylic, dampened the sound, but outside, the whine carried across the otherwise silent airfield. Zuyev pushed the throttle forward just slightly on the left engine control. He watched the EGT, exhaust gas temperature, gauge and the N1/N2, low/high pressure compressor speed, indicators with intense focus. At the correct moment, he introduced fuel. A low, guttural cough, followed by a rush of combustion, signaled the start of the first Klimov RD-33 engine. The entire airframe vibrated with a newfound, powerful life. The sight of the hangar door partially open and the sound of the starting jet were the precise stimuli Zuyev had hoped to avoid. Private Volkov, standing rigid and panicked outside the hangar, was now starting to draw attention, albeit slowly. A junior security officer, Sergeant Petrenko, on a routine patrol in a low-powered Volga staff car, rounded a nearby maintenance block. Petrenko, a man whose career trajectory peaked at sergeant, noticed the open hangar door and the unmistakable sound of a jet engine spooling up, hours before the scheduled start-up time. Petrenko parked the Volga hastily and jogged toward Hangar 3. Private. What in the name of the motherland is going on here? Why is this door open? Where is the maintenance chief? Volkov, completely caught between the authority of Zuyev and the immediate presence of Petrenko, stammered out the cover story. Sergeant, sir. Top secret technical order. Senior Lieutenant Zuyev is conducting an unscheduled, critical test. Direct order from Moscow. Petrenko stopped dead. A direct order from Moscow was a serious matter, but his years of monotonous service instilled a deep suspicion of any deviation from routine. He looked at Zuyev, who was now starting the right engine. The second engine caught with a stronger, more resonant roar, the noise now shaking the ground beneath their feet. The twin-engine start sequence was completed in a remarkable 45 seconds, a testament to Zuyev's proficiency and desperation. Zuyev, seeing the confrontation through the canopy and knowing he had seconds before the sergeant either accepted the lie or escalated, reached for the canopy closing lever. With a heavy, pneumatic hiss, the cockpit sealed itself shut. This action, closing the canopy, was the moment Zuyev became untouchable. No verbal command, no physical threat, could now stop the machine he commanded. He immediately moved to the next critical step, releasing the aircraft brake chocks and confirming all control surfaces were free. Sergeant Petrenko, watching the canopy seal, finally decided the situation was too irregular to ignore. He realized the missing link, the ground crew. Where is the ground crew, Private? Where are the chocks and the tow bar? Who is guiding the aircraft out? Volkov simply stared, realizing the enormity of the lie he was protecting. Petrenko barked into his handheld radio, the sound swallowed by the jet noise. Control tower, this is Patrol 6. Unscheduled startup at Hangar 3. Requesting immediate confirmation on flight plan for Blue 18, repeat, MiG-29 Blue 18. Something is irregular down here. In the cockpit, Zuyev had already selected taxi power. The MiG-29, all 15 tons of lethal technology, began to roll forward. It moved slowly, ponderously at first, then picked up speed. The massive hangar door, still only half-raised, was now an immediate obstacle. Zuyev kept his movements economical, his eyes scanning the essential gauges. He was deliberately taxiing off-center to the right. Petrenko shouted, "He's not waiting for clearance. He's too fast. Volkov, get out of the way." Zuyev steered the jet directly toward the gap between the edge of the hangar door frame and a parked fuel bowser. The wingtip clearance was minimal, less than a meter. He feathered the rudders and applied asymmetric thrust from the twin engines, pushing the jet through the narrow opening. The groundside navigation lights on the bowser flashed past his canopy. He executed the maneuver flawlessly, a demonstration of nerve and flying skill that only a desperate man could summon. As the nose of the MiG cleared the hangar entrance, the shockwave of the jet wash hit the unfortunate Private Volkov and Sergeant Petrenko. Volkov was slammed backward against the concrete wall, momentarily stunned. Petrenko was thrown to the ground, his radio skittering across the tarmac, the sound of the jet overwhelming the airwaves. The moment the MiG-29 was completely clear of the shelter, Zuyev executed a sharp, deliberate left turn, lining up with the main taxiway. He was now fully exposed, a visible, moving target under the eerie base floodlights. He pushed the throttle levers to a higher taxi setting, speeding the aircraft toward the threshold of the main runway, runway 09. He knew the clock was ticking, not just on the drugged squadron, but on the base commander's awakening. The control tower had surely heard Petrenko's frantic, broken transmission. In the air traffic control, ATC, tower, a structure that stood like a cynical glass monolith over the sleeping base, the sudden burst of radio traffic from Patrol 6 had snapped senior controller Captain Tarasov out of his doze. Tarasov was a man of regulations, a stickler for the pre-filed flight plan, and the sound of the MiG-29's engine screaming across the field hours before sunrise was a violation that grated on his core belief in Soviet order. Tarasov snatched the microphone. His voice was laced with sleep and immediate fury. Blue 18. Blue 18, identify yourself and state your intentions. You are operating without clearance. Immediately stop the aircraft and confirm your crew status. In the cockpit of the MiG-29, Zuyev had the radio tuned to the tower frequency, but he remained silent. To acknowledge the call was to confirm his identity and give the tower a chance to negotiate or, worse, scramble interceptors. Silence was his shield. He accelerated, the nosewheel steering guiding the jet with precision as he approached the intersection where the taxiway met the main runway threshold. Tarasov, receiving only static and the building roar of the jet, felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. This wasn't a mistake, this was a deliberate act. He looked down the runway, his night vision binoculars confirming the terrifying reality. The MiG-29 was rolling, accelerating, preparing for takeoff. Alert! Alert all stations. Unidentified unauthorized aircraft taking the runway. Initiate code red protocol. Runway barrier deployment, now. Scramble the ready alert pair. Tarasov shouted orders into 3 different microphones simultaneously, his calm facade shattering into panic. Just ahead of Zuyev, as the MiG-29 began its final turn onto the runway centerline, the emergency system lurched into action. 2 reinforced steel arrestor cables, designed to stop jets with landing gear failure, snapped across the runway, their anchoring mechanisms thudding into place. This was the base's last-ditch ground defense to prevent unauthorized takeoff. If Zuyev hit those cables at speed, the heavy steel would likely rip his landing gear off and send the $25 million fighter jet skidding into a fireball. But Zuyev had anticipated this. He hadn't just studied the flight procedures, he'd memorized the emergency ground security countermeasures. He knew the Ka-36D ejection seat was armed and ready, but he had no intention of using it. He would not give up the jet now. As the nosewheel touched the runway centerline, Zuyev executed a maneuver that was technically illegal for a taxiing jet. He applied maximum differential braking, hard on the right wheel, light on the left, while feeding the right engine a momentary burst of power. The MiG-29 slewed violently sideways in a controlled skid, the nosewheel tracking exactly parallel to the deployed cables. The right main landing gear tire passed literally centimeters from the anchoring block of the first cable. He straightened the jet just as he cleared the second cable, a triumphant, almost insane grin flashing across his face in the green light of the instrument panel. The arrestor cables, designed for emergency landings, were useless against his precise, deliberate maneuvering. Tarasov, watching the near miss through his binoculars, slammed his fist onto the control console. He dodged it. He dodged the cables. Who is this pilot? The activation of the cables and the code red alert had now fully awakened the base, and sirens began to wail across the field, a mournful, drawn-out cry that signaled high alarm. Floodlights along the runway perimeter snapped on, bathing the MiG-29 in a brilliant, damning light. Zuyev ignored the chaos. His focus narrowed to the 3 primary instruments necessary for takeoff: the airspeed indicator, the attitude indicator, and the engine pressure ratio, EPR, gauges. He smoothly pushed the twin throttle levers past the military power setting and into the full afterburner detent. The effect was instantaneous and staggering. The 2 powerful Klimov RD-33 engines injected raw fuel into the exhaust stream. Behind the MiG-29, 2 massive cones of brilliant orange-blue flame erupted, tearing through the darkness. The acceleration was crushing, pinning Zuyev deep into his ejection seat. The roar changed from a high-pitched scream to a deep, hammering thunder that echoed off the Caucasus Mountains surrounding the base. He released the brakes. The jet began to hurtle down the runway. V1, decision speed, VR, rotation speed, and V2, takeoff safety speed, flashed in his mind. He was heavier than normal, the aircraft was fully armed and fueled for a long sortie, not a quick dash. He needed every meter of the runway. As the speedometer climbed past 250 kilometers per hour, the radio crackled again, this time with a voice Zuyev recognized, the base commander, Colonel Grishin, his voice hoarse with alarm, patched directly into the emergency frequency. Blue 18. This is the commander. Stop the aircraft immediately. You are committing an act of treason against the Soviet Union. I order you to cut your engines, now. I will personally guarantee your safe return if you comply. Zuyev merely rotated the stick back, gently lifting the nose wheel off the ground. He was past the point of no return. The runway lights blurred into a single, continuous white streak. The last words he would ever hear from the motherland were a shouted, desperate plea for surrender. The aircraft was alive, powerful, and rising. The MiG-29, Blue 18, clawed its way into the dark Georgian sky. Zuyev hauled the throttles back slightly to military power, retracting the landing gear with a reassuring clunk. The warning light for the wheels extinguished, confirming the aircraft was now clean and fully airborne. The G-forces pressed him down, but they were a welcome sensation, the exhilarating force of freedom in motion. Below him, the Mikitskaya base was now a sprawling constellation of chaos. Headlights crisscrossed the tarmac, and the wail of sirens was swallowed by the jet's own roar, turning into a faint, distant insect buzz. He executed a steep, climbing turn to the southwest, a direct vector toward the Turkish border, approximately 80 kilometers away. The Black Sea coastline lay just beyond, a dark, defining line separating the Soviet bloc from NATO's flank. In the control tower, Colonel Grishin was galvanized into frantic action. Launch the ready pair. Now. I want 2 MiG-23s airborne in 60 seconds. Authorization for intercept? Use any means necessary, but do not shoot him down inside Soviet airspace. Push him back. If he crosses the border, we lose the fulcrum, we lose national security. But Zuyev had planned for this delay. The standard ready alert posture required the standby pilots to be in their flight gear, but the jets themselves needed final checks, cover removal, and engine starts. Even 60 seconds was optimistic. Furthermore, the drugged squadron included the primary ground crew who handled the rapid armament and fueling process. The ensuing confusion and the critical lack of manpower meant the ready alert pair was already far behind the escapee. As Zuyev punched in the navigation coordinates for Trabzon, Turkey, into the MiG systems, he climbed rapidly, aiming for a high-speed, high-altitude dash. His immediate goal was to gain enough altitude to make the detection systems of the Soviet ground radar network less effective. He needed to fly beneath the primary radar's detection envelope, which often overlooked fast, low-flying targets, or fly so high that he would be mistaken for a standard high-altitude flight. He chose the latter, safer option, pushing the aircraft past 12,000 meters. Suddenly, the cockpit's radar warning receiver, RWR, lit up like a Christmas tree, screaming in alert tone. The screen showed a massive, directional lock from a ground-based SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile, SAM, battery several kilometers to the north. Moscow was mobilizing its air defense network. They weren't just scrambling fighters, they were preparing to shoot. Zuyev's hands moved automatically, reflexively. He initiated an extreme high-G evasive maneuver, pitching the nose down violently and banking hard to the west, towards the sea. He simultaneously deployed a dense ribbon of chaff, tiny metal strips designed to confuse enemy radar. The RWR tone immediately changed from a solid lock to an intermittent flicker, indicating the missile battery was struggling to reacquire him through the clutter. "They're not trying to push me back, they're trying to kill me," Zuyev muttered to himself, the realization hardening his resolve. His decision to defect wasn't just treason, it was a matter of immediate life and death. Moments later, the radio crackled again, this time with desperate voices speaking Georgian-accented Russian. It was the two pilots of the Ready Alert MiG-23s, airborne and climbing, trying to coordinate their intercept based on intermittent radar data. "Blue 18, we have you visual. You are ordered to jettison your external tanks and follow us back to the base," the intercept leader, Major Kozlov, shouted over the emergency frequency, his voice distorted by the urgency and distance. Zuyev briefly considered a ruse but dismissed it. They were too close. Instead, he employed the MiG-29's superior low-speed handling and powerful engines. He pulled a tight, near-vertical climb, using the RD-33's thrust-to-weight advantage to gain a crucial energy lead. The MiG-23s, slightly older and heavier, could not match the sudden, violent acceleration and altitude gain. He looked down at the radar repeater. The two red blips representing the MiG-23s were struggling to keep up with his unexpected trajectory. They were still climbing in a standard intercept pattern while Zuyev was already flattening out his ascent, having achieved his target altitude of 14,000 meters, over 45,000 feet. He pushed the throttles once more, hitting Mach 1.5, his jet leaving the two pursuers behind in a rapidly expanding envelope of distance and time. The border was now only minutes away. The vast, dark expanse of the Black Sea was directly beneath him. The MiG-29 was now a silent, screaming projectile traveling at over 1.5 times the speed of sound, traversing the immense darkness over the Black Sea. Zuyev's internal timer was fixated on the Turkish Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, the imaginary line in the sky that represented safety. His fuel consumption at this speed was astronomical, but he had loaded maximum fuel, gambling that speed was more critical than range. In the cockpit, the only sound apart from the low hiss of the oxygen mask was the urgent, panicked chatter coming over the radio from the two trailing MiG-23s, who were now struggling to maintain radar lock on the fleeting fulcrum. "Blue 18. Blue 18, Major Kozlov is ordering you to reduce speed. You are dangerously close to the boundary. We have authorization to fire if you cross the demarcation line." The threat was clear, but Zuyev knew it was hollow. Firing a missile across an international boundary, especially into the airspace of a NATO country like Turkey, would be an act of war, a consequence even the panicked Soviet command would be hesitant to trigger over a single deserter, even one flying a MiG-29. Zuyev glanced at his head-up display, HUD. The distance remaining was scrolling down rapidly, 30 kilometers, 25, 20. He was flying a calculated, precise trajectory designed to minimize time in the final, most dangerous stretch. Below him, the Soviet Union's coastal radar network was now fully active, pouring enormous amounts of electromagnetic energy into the sky in a desperate attempt to track and target him. The RWR in the cockpit was a continuous, frantic alarm, indicating multiple tracking radars scanning his position. He was a beacon of high-speed defiance. He compensated by weaving the jet slightly, forcing the ground systems to constantly reacquire his position, buying precious fractions of a second. Back at Mikitskaya, the horror was still unfolding. Colonel Grishin's command post was a chaotic scene of officers trying to awaken drugged subordinates, contacting Moscow, and scrambling reserve forces. The two MiG-23s were the last line of defense, and they were losing the race. Kozlov, if you cannot turn him, take him down. Do not let the asset leave Soviet territory. The commander's voice, now relayed through the main command frequency, was a strange shriek of professional devastation. Major Kozlov hesitated. The border was too close. His training and the political ramifications warred violently in his mind. He armed a missile, the cockpit screen displaying the ready lock, his finger hovering over the fire button. He had a brief, split-second lock on the faint exhaust plume of the MiG-29, but the target was moving away at an almost impossible speed. Zuyev saw the final, terrifying flash on his RWR, a solid, momentary lock from one of the interceptors, the signal for a missile firing sequence. He had no time for a complex evasive maneuver. Instead, he executed a radical, high-speed jink, pulling the stick sharply to the side, then immediately back to center, followed by a double burst of chaff and flares. The move disrupted Kozlov's missile guidance radar just as the system was authorizing launch. The lock broke. The missile stayed on the rail. Zuyev's focus returned to the HUD. 5 kilometers. He held the aircraft level, maintaining Mach 1.5. He crossed an unmarked, invisible line in the sky. A profound, absolute silence descended on the MiG-29's radio. The voices of Kozlov and Grishin were gone. They had been forced to turn back, or perhaps they had simply given up the chase, knowing the international implications of pursuit into Turkish airspace. Zuyev had done it. He had flown the Soviet Union's prize fighter jet directly into the embrace of its enemies. He reduced the throttles from afterburner to military cruise power. The silence was palpable. He looked down at the dark, churning waters of the Black Sea and felt the cold, hard weight of what he had just done. It wasn't triumph, it was the chilling realization of permanent severance. He was now a man without a country, carrying the Soviet Union's most sensitive military secrets and a multi-million-dollar piece of hardware. Zuyev began the descent towards Trabzon, the main airport on Turkey's northern coast. He had only one final major risk remaining, convincing the Turkish Air Force, a fully mobilized NATO force, that he was not an attacking Soviet aircraft, but a defector seeking asylum. As Zuyev crossed into Turkish airspace, the MiG-29, the symbol of Soviet power, immediately became a massive, blinking hostile threat on the radar screens of the NATO Integrated Air Defense System, NATONADS. The system was designed precisely to detect and neutralize intrusions from the east. Within seconds, the Turkish Regional Command Post, operating under the umbrella of NATO, was jolted into its highest state of readiness. Zuyev's RWR, which had just gone silent on the Soviet frequencies, now began a frantic series of new, foreign alarms. It was being painted by multiple Turkish land-based surveillance radars and, more immediately, by the powerful, targeting radar of airborne interceptors. He immediately attempted to contact the Turkish tower. He switched his radio to the international emergency frequency, 121.5 MHz, and keyed the microphone. His voice, though calm, betrayed the monumental stress of the moment. Unidentified aircraft in Turkish airspace, this is Soviet Air Force pilot calling. I am Alexander Zuyev. I am defecting. I request immediate escort and safe landing at Trabzon Airport. I repeat, I am unarmed and defecting. His transmission was met with silence, followed by a burst of rapid, clipped Turkish. They weren't ignoring him, they were trying to decipher his intentions and rapidly processing the unprecedented event. A Soviet MiG-29, the newest variant, appearing unannounced and announcing a defection, was not in any NATO playbook. Minutes later, the silence was broken by a clear, confident voice speaking heavily accented English. Unidentified aircraft, this is Turkish Air Force, call sign, Hawk 1. You are in a restricted zone. Do not change course or altitude. You are being intercepted. Follow my instructions precisely or you will be treated as hostile. Zuyev peered out of his cockpit. Through the haze, he could make out the sharp, purposeful shapes of two F-16 fighting Falcons, their wingtips adorned with live missiles, flanking him. The Turkish pilots were flying tight formation, a clear sign of their wariness. The F-16 was a formidable sight, the Western counterpart to his own machine. Zuyev had spent years training to fight these exact aircraft. Now, they were his escorts. He kept his hands clearly visible on the flight controls, a non-verbal assurance to the Turkish pilots that he was complying. He replied in careful English, Hawk 1, this is Zuyev. I understand. I have low fuel reserves. Request vector to Trabzon runway. I have confidential material. Hawk 1, the lead F-16 pilot, maintained a rigid formation. Maintain current speed. Reduce altitude to 3,000 meters. Follow our lead. Do not deviate. Any sudden movement will be met with immediate force. Zuyev complied, easing the throttles back further. The descent began, a slow, controlled surrender into enemy territory. The tension in the cockpit was almost unbearable. He was surrounded by NATO aircraft, the people he was trained to kill, but they represented his only chance at freedom. As they descended through the clouds, the lights of Trabzon, a bustling port city on the Anatolian coast, came into view. The airport below was in chaos. Civilian traffic had been halted. Fire and rescue crews were lining the runway, and dozens of military vehicles were positioned around the perimeter. The entire facility was on military lockdown. Hawk 1 broke the silence. Zuyev, extend your landing gear. Reduce speed to approach minimum. Follow me onto runway 11. Be advised, ground security is armed and ready. Zuyev lowered the MiG-29's robust landing gear, the thud confirming the mechanical lock. The cockpit's internal screens, moments ago displaying combat data, were now filled with the prosaic information of an approach checklist. He was landing a highly sensitive Soviet asset, a fully operational, armed MiG-29, in the heart of a NATO country. This was more than a defection, it was a colossal intelligence coup. As he turned onto the final approach, the sight was surreal. He saw the brightly colored markings of the Trabzon runway, and beyond the wire, the silhouette of a Turkish coastal patrol boat, symbolizing the permanent break with the continent he had just left. The weight of the Soviet state was no longer on his back, it was now a fury boiling in Moscow, aimed at the airfield he had just abandoned. The approach was flawless, a final, defiant performance of professional mastery. Zuyev touched down the MiG-29 Fulcrum smoothly on the main runway at Trabzon. The twin engines roared in reverse thrust, the massive fighter slowing rapidly as he brought the machine to a controlled stop, exactly as he had done countless times on desolate Soviet runways. The sheer volume of the reverse thrust alone was enough to announce the arrival of the Soviet Union's top fighter jet to the entire northern Turkish coast. The Turkish F-16 escorts peeled off with a final, non-committal wave of their wings. Zuyev taxied the MiG to a designated, isolated section of the apron, following the insistent hand gestures of a Turkish marshalling officer who seemed to be a mix of terrified and thrilled. As the MiG rolled to a stop and Zuyev shut down the engines, the final, dying groan of the Klimov RD-33s marking the definitive end of his Soviet service, an unnerving silence descended upon the airfield. He climbed out of the cockpit, pulling his helmet off and leaving it on the ejection seat. The morning sun was just beginning to touch the distant peaks of the Pontic Mountains, casting a golden light on the surreal scene. Zuyev stood atop the fuselage, a lone figure in a faded blue Soviet flight suit, blinking in the new light. Below him, a massive, silent crowd was waiting. It wasn't just airport security and fire trucks. There was a full contingent of Turkish military personnel, commandos in olive drab, their weapons held at the low-ready position, and, most significantly, a group of smartly dressed men in suits, clearly intelligence and government officials, their faces a mixture of astonishment and grim, professional interest. As Zuyev dropped lightly from the wing onto the Turkish tarmac, he raised his hands in a gesture of non-aggression and surrender. The moment his feet touched the ground, he was surrounded. The Turkish soldiers did not rush him, but their presence was overwhelming, their rifles centered on his chest. A tall, impeccably dressed Turkish officer, Colonel Hayati, stepped forward, accompanied by one of the men in suits, who carried a small recorder. The official spoke first, in fluent, precise Russian. "Welcome to Turkey, Major Zuyev." Zuyev corrected him immediately, looking the official directly in the eye. "Senior Lieutenant Alexander Zuyev. I have defected from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. I formally request political asylum in Turkey, or in a nation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization." The official nodded slowly, absorbing the gravity of the statement. The intelligence value of a MiG-29 pilot, and the complete aircraft itself, was incalculable. It represented a direct pipeline into Soviet military doctrine, technology, and cockpit procedures. Colonel Hayati then issued an order in clipped Turkish, and the perimeter tightened. A specialized Turkish Air Force team, wearing gloves and carrying covered containers, approached the MiG-29. Their mission was clear: secure the aircraft as a military prize, photograph every detail, and ensure its advanced avionics and weapons systems remained intact for immediate inspection by NATO experts. The MiG-29 was now undergoing the most intense, hostile technical review in its short history. Zuyev was led away, but not before he looked back at Blue 18. The aircraft, designed to be a fearsome weapon of communist air superiority, now sat lonely and exposed on a foreign runway, its dark gray paint stark against the bright Turkish concrete. He had not just flown away, he had stolen the Soviet Union's deepest secrets and delivered them, gift-wrapped, to the West. The first reports of the incident were already beginning to filter back to Moscow, bypassing the stunned officers at Mikhatskaya. The story was so audacious, so utterly unbelievable, that military high command initially dismissed it as a massive, deliberate disinformation campaign orchestrated by NATO. It took hours for the Soviet Defense Ministry to accept the terrifying truth: one of their most valuable fighter jets, fully armed, had been flown out of the USSR by its own pilot, who had first incapacitated his entire squadron with drugged porridge. The security failure was catastrophic, exposing gaping vulnerabilities in airfield control, readiness procedures, and, most damningly, the trust placed in its most highly trained personnel. The embarrassment was profound, the military ramifications enormous. Moscow's immediate reaction was to demand the return of Zuyev and the aircraft, a demand that Turkey, a key NATO member, was already preparing to reject. The moment the initial, unbelievable report of the MiG-29's defection reached Moscow, specifically the offices of the Soviet Air Force High Command and the KGB's Third Chief Directorate, responsible for military counterintelligence, the reaction was not panic, but a furious, toxic mix of denial and immediate, aggressive retribution. How could a frontline fighter, the pride of the Soviet aviation industry, simply vanish? And how could an entire squadron be incapacitated without a shot fired? An emergency session of the Politburo was called, albeit a delayed one due to the slow speed of information dissemination and the sheer implausibility of the act. The official line initially circulated was that the plane had suffered a technical malfunction, crashed into the Black Sea, and the pilot had been lost. This was an attempt to save face and control the narrative, but the truth was too visible: the MiG-29 was sitting on a Turkish runway, surrounded by NATO investigators. Within hours, a specialized, high-level KGB investigative team was dispatched to Mikhatskaya Air Base. Their mandate was simple: understand the security breach and purge those responsible. The scene they found was a tableau of total breakdown. In the mess hall, the investigators were greeted by the sight of 22 officers and men, pilots, navigators, and technicians, slowly regaining consciousness, suffering from severe nausea and disorientation. The cook, who insisted he saw nothing amiss, was immediately detained under suspicion of collaboration. The porridge cauldron, scraped clean but for residual traces, was carted off for chemical analysis. The reality of the drug-induced stupor was undeniable. Colonel Grishin, the base commander, was found in his office, chain-smoking and frantically attempting to piece together the sequence of events. The investigation quickly determined that Zuyev had exploited the base's single most common vulnerability: complacency. The conscript guard, Private Volkov, was arrested on the spot. His testimony, detailing how Zuyev had used a false, top-secret Moscow directive to force the hangar door open, painted a devastating picture of how easily authority could be manipulated in the rigid Soviet system. The security lapses piled up: the missing external power unit key, which Zuyev, as a senior pilot, had access to, the predictable patrol schedule that allowed him to bypass key checkpoints, and the failure of the control tower to launch the interceptors in time, a delay compounded by the drugged ground crew who should have been preparing the standby jets. The KGB investigation concluded with a chilling summary: the defection was not a random act of opportunity, but a meticulously planned act of political sabotage executed by a skilled operative who had turned against the state. The fact that Zuyev had deliberately chosen a fully fueled and armed MiG-29, demonstrating his full knowledge of the aircraft's readiness status, underlined the depth of his disloyalty and preparation. The repercussions were swift and brutal. Colonel Grishin was immediately relieved of command, arrested, and faced charges of criminal negligence and treasonous failure to secure a strategic military asset. He would spend years in a military penal colony. Dozens of officers and enlisted men, despite being victims of Zuyev's drug plot, were demoted, transferred to remote posts in Siberia, or placed under formal investigation for failing to adhere to alertness protocols. The entire operational readiness of the Mikhatskaya 176th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment was dismantled and reconstructed under new command. In Moscow, the central concern shifted from punishing those responsible to mitigating the catastrophic intelligence loss. The MiG-29 was the crown jewel of Soviet short-range air superiority. Its radar, its fire control system, its electronic countermeasures (ECM) suite, and its powerful engines were now being examined by the United States Air Force and NATO's most advanced technical analysts. They would learn how to counter the fulcrum in combat, rendering years of Soviet technological investment suddenly obsolete. The Soviet propaganda machine attempted to bury the event, but international news services were already plastering the image of the rogue MiG-29 on a sunny Turkish runway across every major newspaper. The Cold War had just delivered one of its most stunning, and embarrassing, victories for the West. For NATO intelligence, the arrival of Alexander Zuyev and his pristine MiG-29 Fulcrum on Turkish soil was Christmas, a birthday, and a major military parade rolled into one. The plane was immediately secured inside a massive, heavily guarded hangar at a Turkish military facility, shielded from Soviet satellite observation. The mission was codenamed P-33, referencing the MiG-29's Internal Design Bureau designation. Within 48 hours, a specialized technical team composed of United States Air Force, USAF, Turkish Air Force, and CIA technical analysts descended upon the aircraft. This was a rare, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to conduct a full, hands-on, non-destructive evaluation of the Soviet Union's most advanced tactical fighter. Every surface, every antenna, every wire, and every system was subjected to intense scrutiny. The cockpit was the first target. The Americans, in particular, were desperate to understand the N019 pulse Doppler look-down/shoot-down radar, the heart of the MiG-29's fire control system. They wanted to know its operating frequencies, its power output, its ECCM, electronic countermeasures, capabilities, and, most critically, its vulnerabilities. Detailed photographic and spectroscopic analysis was conducted on the radar dish and its housing. The analysts meticulously documented the Soviet philosophy on target acquisition and tracking. Next came the weapons systems. The R-27, AA-10 Alamo, medium-range missiles and the revolutionary R-73, AA-11 Archer, high-off-boresight short-range missiles were a goldmine. The R-73, in particular, was an object of immediate fascination. It was superior to any equivalent Western short-range missile at the time, particularly due to its helmet-mounted sight capability, allowing the pilot to simply look at a target and fire. NATO experts disassembled and analyzed the guidance mechanisms, the infrared seeker heads, and the propellant structure. The insights gained led directly to accelerated development of equivalent Western missile technology, specifically influencing the design of the AIM-9X Sidewinder and the Osram programs. Zuyev himself was the other half of the intelligence coup. He spent weeks in intense debriefings, first with Turkish intelligence, and later with CIA and USAF interrogators. He provided an invaluable oral blueprint of the MiG-29, its operating limits, maintenance requirements, and most importantly, the Soviet training regimen and tactical doctrine. He explained how Soviet pilots were taught to fly the Fulcrum, their standard maneuvers, their intercept profiles, and their weaknesses in air combat maneuvering against NATO fighters. Zuyev's information was used to update NATO pilot training manuals overnight. The knowledge that Zuyev had drugged his squadron mates, rather than engaging in a firefight, was also confirmed by the pilot, explaining the extraordinary silence during his initial escape. A critical finding was the jet's engine life. Zuyev confirmed that the powerful Klimov RD-33 turbofan engines had a relatively short operational lifespan and required extensive maintenance, a critical weakness in sustained combat operations. The air superiority fighter, previously feared as an invincible threat, was revealed to be a magnificent but high-maintenance machine with distinct operational limitations. The combined intelligence gleaned from the aircraft and the pilot allowed NATO to immediately formulate new electronic countermeasure tactics to jam the MiG-29's radar and defeat its fire control system. The detailed diagrams and schematics Zuyev provided gave NATO analysts a cheat sheet for future aerial engagements. The most embarrassing part for Moscow was the fate of the airframe itself. After the technical analysts were finished, the decision was made to ship the MiG-29 to an undisclosed location in the United States, likely the infamous Area 51, Groom Lake, test facility, for detailed flight testing. Western test pilots would fly the jet extensively, replicating Soviet combat tactics and developing effective counterattacks against a live, hostile platform. The Soviet Union had effectively handed the key to defeating its most valuable air asset to its greatest enemy. The intelligence loss was deemed by CIA Director William J. Casey to be one of the most significant intelligence coups of the late Cold War era. The Soviet military machine would spend the remainder of the Cold War scrambling to retrofit and update the MiG-29 to correct the vulnerabilities Zuyev had so expertly exposed. Alexander Zuyev was not merely a pilot, he was a walking, talking library of Soviet military secrets. His defection, once the initial intelligence phase was complete, led to his rapid relocation to the United States, where he was placed under the protective wing of various government agencies. He was a prize, but also a security risk, and his existence had to be managed with extreme care. The Soviet state, even in its twilight years, possessed a long reach. Zuyev's new life was defined by two parallel experiences: extraordinary personal freedom and constant professional utilization. He was granted a substantial settlement and provided with a new identity, but his professional expertise was too valuable to waste. He continued his work, not as a fighter pilot soaring through the skies, but as an advisor and consultant for the very military establishment he had once been trained to fight. He worked closely with the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, and various aerospace contractors, helping them refine their assessment of Soviet air power and contributing directly to the development of new Western aircraft counter-technologies. His personal narrative became one of the key propaganda tools of the late Cold War. He was presented to selected media outlets as a symbol of the Soviet system's failure, a highly educated, highly skilled officer who chose personal freedom over the constraints of communism. He detailed the crippling bureaucracy, the shortages, the petty corruption, and the stifling intellectual environment that had ultimately driven him to risk his life. His story of spiking the breakfast kasha became a legendary, darkly comic tale within intelligence circles, showcasing the audacity and ingenuity required to defeat the colossal, yet deeply flawed, Soviet system. However, the psychological weight of his action remained heavy. Zuyev had left behind everything: his family, his friends, and the deeply ingrained culture of his homeland. He was fully aware that in the USSR, he was an official persona non grata, a traitor whose name was erased from official records and whose actions had led to the ruin and punishment of his former comrades. Even with the protection of the US government, he lived with the persistent, chilling awareness that the KGB still considered him a legitimate target. He could never truly relax, constantly looking over his shoulder, acutely aware that his sudden flight from the Soviet world meant he would never truly belong in the American one. He continued to fly, though strictly within the confines of military testing and simulation, often acting as the Red Force pilot in sophisticated training simulations. He sat in the cockpits of Western fighters, utilizing the knowledge of Soviet tactics he had shared, and helping American pilots find the blind spots and weaknesses of the MiG-29 that he knew intimately. This was his penance and his contribution to his adopted country. His existence was proof that the Soviet regime's control was not absolute, yet he remained a man tragically disconnected, forever linked to the frozen food aisles of suburban America and the deadly secrets hidden inside a top-secret Soviet jet. His escape marked a pivotal moment, less a clash of arms and more a psychological break. It demonstrated that the ideological commitment of even the most privileged members of the Soviet military elite was fraying. The pilot who drugged his peers and stole the star fighter of the Soviet fleet was not a hero to his former countrymen, but he was a powerful, symbolic weapon for the West, a flesh-and-blood testament to the human desire to escape oppression, even when that escape was achieved through betrayal and the sacrifice of one's entire past. The immediate, tangible consequence of Alexander Zuyev's defection and the theft of the MiG-29 was the most profound intelligence windfall of the latter half of the Cold War. The fighter jet itself was meticulously disassembled, studied, catalogued, and then flown repeatedly by elite U.S. test pilots, most notably at the classified ranges in Nevada. The insights gained from the Fulcrum's N-019 radar system, its R-73 missile technology, and its general performance envelope were immediately incorporated into U.S. defense planning and weapon system development. This direct knowledge shortened the development cycle for several American counter-technologies by years, saving billions of dollars and ensuring a tactical edge for NATO in the event of a conflict. The operational unit Zuyev left behind, the 176th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment at Mikhatskaya, was subjected to a thorough and humiliating overhaul. Every single member was deemed compromised. The KGB enforced a complete restructuring, imposing draconian new security protocols that became the standard across the entire Soviet air defense network. New access control methods were implemented, requiring dual authentication and biometric checks for high-value assets. The incident exposed the critical vulnerability of relying on internal trust and bureaucratic procedure, forcing the Soviets to shift towards hardened, technology-driven security measures. The simple act of pouring sleeping powder into breakfast porridge effectively forced one of the world's largest militaries to rewrite its security manual. The diplomatic fallout was sharp but contained. Moscow issued formal, angry protests to Ankara and Washington, demanding the immediate return of the stolen state property and the traitor Zuyev. Turkey, supported fully by its NATO allies, politely but firmly refused. The presence of the MiG-29 in NATO hands became a silent, powerful negotiating chip in subsequent arms control talks. Over time, Zuyev's story morphed into a legend within the global aviation and intelligence communities. It stood as a towering example of individual audacity overcoming systemic oppression. It was a story told in hushed tones, the pilot who saw his only path to freedom lay in betraying his nation, incapacitating his comrades, and flying a multi-million-dollar fighter jet into the hands of the enemy. The name Alexander Zuyev became synonymous with a singular, perfect act of defection, a narrative tool used to demonstrate the moral decay and inevitable collapse of the Soviet regime. The ultimate irony of the incident is that Zuyev's act occurred on the very cusp of the Soviet Union's final decline. While the MiG-29 was being disassembled in America and while Zuyev was detailing Soviet flaws, the political and economic structure of the USSR was already beginning its final, catastrophic unraveling. His escape, while causing immense internal upheaval, served as a powerful prophecy. If the Soviet state could not even secure its most prized war machine from its own trusted officers, how could it possibly secure the loyalty of its vast, disaffected population? Alexander Zuyev faded into his new life in the West, having achieved a unique form of permanent liberty, albeit one perpetually shadowed by his past. The MiG-29, Blue 18, eventually ended its classified career as a test platform and was either scrapped or remains locked away in a deep vault, its mission complete. The only remnants of that cold, anxious dawn in Soviet Georgia were the altered security procedures, the ruined careers of its officers, and the undeniable truth that, for a few hours, one man, one jet, and one spiked breakfast changed the dynamic of global military intelligence. It was a flight of singular importance, a desperate gamble that paid off with the priceless currency of information and freedom. A flight that Soviet officers, struggling to comprehend how one man neutralized an entire squadron with a bowl of porridge, simply could not believe. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the Cold War's most incredible defection stories, please take a moment to like this video, drop a comment letting us know your thoughts on Zuyev's escape, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage, espionage, and aviation history.